Struck by a strange asteroid and surrounded by a giant wall of fog, the Pachorsk Radius is a disaster zone frozen in space and time. Its ruins echo with humanity, bodiless sounds, warped destruction, and people's remains stuck in their final moments like a paranormal Pompeii. It's a place that seems completely devoid of any activity, and yet, at the same time, home to an activity all its own. When Into the Radius released into early access in 2019, I was pretty stoked, excited enough that I decided to play for 10 hours, make a video about my experience, and then give the game some time to grow. Well, that time has passed. Into the Radius has since left early access, and I've journeyed past its great wall of fog yet again, this time all the way through. To CM Games' credit, Into the Radius hasn't just changed, but has improved. Updates have been diligent and, as far as I can tell, substantial. Lots of big changes for what is a big and ambitious game. Into the Radius is a mashup of survival horror with the trappings of a military simulator, two ingredients that may not sound like they taste good together, but definitely do. Bullets have to be loaded into magazines, magazines packed onto your person, and the slides, bolts, and safeties on weapons pulled back and switched off. If you have different bullet types of the same caliber, like Full Metal Jacket and Armor Piercing, you'll want to load them into separate magazines and keep a mental note of where you stored them. From the get-go, the Radius, consisting of a few mini open worlds, is almost entirely free to explore. Missions tell you where to go, but how you approach objectives, how much you explore the Radius, and even how you organize your backpack is up to you. Progression is as almost open-ended as it can get. Which weapons and attachments you buy and what equipment you carry is all going to be determined by how you play. Maybe you're the type that packs a bunch of food and ammo, accepts a handful of missions, and tries to survive a few long days in the wasteland. Maybe you're the type that takes it one mission at a time and packs light. There's a lot to learn, like how certain enemies behave and what various anomalies and artifacts do, but Into the Radius makes learning all that fun, and it nurtures player autonomy with minimal direction and lots of different weapons. There is no limit to how much time you can spend in the Radius, but as you venture out, your condition depreciates. You need food and ammo, sure, but weapons, as well as weapon attachments like magazines and suppressors, need to be cleaned and repaired with use. Planning a trip out into the Radius is kind of like planning a camping trip. When you're at the base, a safe area outside the Radius, you pack your bag with some food, a knife or two, and maybe scan the map for places you can sleep for the night. But even if you scavenge some food and ammo, you'll eventually need to return to base to maintain and restock gear. It may all sound somewhat tedious and meticulous, and I guess in some ways it is, but I absolutely love it. I love preloading magazines with different types of ammo, organizing all the stuff I want to keep in my room, and keeping track of my inventory. Slowly building your kit from a dinky Makarov into something more capable and combat ready is deeply satisfying. And maybe you happen to find a weapon you can't afford out in the Radius, so you carry it back to base and restore it back to mint condition. As harsh as it can treat mistakes, Into the Radius also rewards exploration and risk-taking, which makes it fun to take your time, poke around, and see what you can find. The more you explore the Radius, the more familiar you get with where there are pockets of anomalies and where certain enemies spawn and patrol. After a few hours, you're planning routes in your head, thinking of which paths to follow, what enemies you might encounter, which safe houses are nearby, and how quickly you can return to base, because you definitely don't want to lose track of time. Every 4 in-game days, by default, the tide washes over the Radius. Those giant fog walls close in, resetting loot, shifting the position of anomaly fields, and respawning enemies. If you're caught in the tide, you get teleported to a random location of the area you're in. Into the Radius is a joy to explore, discover, and learn, all while you're left to build your own expertise in knowing the lay of the land and what you want to pack for any given mission. Visually, Into the Radius may not be all that pretty to look at, but I think it's a great example of a game where the art direction shines much brighter and is more important than its visuals. The zone is a wasteland that occasionally borders on the surreal, housing some legitimately mesmerizing, dreamlike sights. This creates an atmosphere where gameplay bounces between moments of heavy tension and a calm, somewhat unsettling serenity. What Pechorsk was like before the asteroid strike, Into the Radius does a nice job portraying. There are plenty of surviving notes, recordings, and dialogue snippets that give little insights into the everyday lives of the people who lived here. Slices of life providing color and personality to what has become a toxic and ashen disaster zone. You are Explorer 61, of whom not much is known. In the opening tutorial, Explorer 61 awakens seemingly already in the Radius and meets Katya, a woman who says she's trapped somewhere in the Radius and needs help. The UNPSC, the organization that sends stalkers like yourself into the Radius for experimentation and the like, is quickly established as an exploitative, untrustworthy, and highly corporate organization. Think Aperture Science. So the narrative has a simple setup. Rescue Katya from the perils of the Radius, complete missions for the UNPSC, and uncover the mysteries of the Radius. While the cake is indeed a lie, and the cryptic, perhaps even malicious motives of the UNPSC are antagonistic, what we don't get is a narrative that develops as the game goes on. The micro-stories you'll find on these notes and in interactions with Katya can be somewhat interesting, but plot, they are not. The lack of a strong central narrative and Into the Radius's inability to pull all of its narrative elements together is indicative of the game's other problems. Even after full release, Into the Radius still carries with it a lot of early access quirks and some serious growing pains. Numerous small miscellaneous issues, especially once encountered repeatedly after 50 plus hours of gameplay, keep Into the Radius from being a more polished, clean experience and make it one that's inconsistent, shaky, and uneven. Some of these problems are at best annoying, but others are, at worst, physically disorienting. Portions of the game remain seemingly unfinished. More than a few times I found myself clipping through a wall or getting hung up on small bumps in the environment. Other times, the player character will step up on top of objects that don't need to be climbable, like chairs and small boxes, which can be dizzying and makes grabbing objects difficult. The sound mixing is inconsistent. Random things like bullets hitting metal targets, as well as a few weapons, are loud enough that I have to turn the in-game volume way down to make it comfortable. Unfortunately, you can't reduce weapon sounds individually, only sound effects in general. I've resorted to continuously bouncing in and out of the audio settings, turning the levels down and back up again depending on the situation, an inconvenient band-aid solution for a really strange problem. When you equip a gas mask, which you'll need to get through toxic environments, each ocular of the headset gets its own vignette, simulating the mask's two eyes. The problem is that, rather than my brain putting the two images together like it does with the VR headset itself, I see both circles simultaneously, creating an image that looks something like this. Wearing the gas mask actually made me physically uncomfortable. Not outright nauseous, but I definitely got some moderate eye strain. I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty high tolerance for weird VR visuals and the like, but I can't imagine this is good for those with lower tolerances. Whether this is a design oversight or an attempt to give the gas mask a more realistic look, it just doesn't work. Other VR games have found ways to make equipment that sits on or above the eyes, like night vision goggles, limit peripheral vision, and stay comfortable. On a separate level, the inclusion of a gas mask Into the Radius feels more obligatory than creative. When I think about some of the best moments across Stalker and even Metro, those dives into super toxic, dangerous environments are among those series' best, most intense, immersive, and exciting. With Into the Radius, the gas mask is largely delegated to short side missions, which is ultimately good considering how it looks, but a disappointing result nonetheless. Mitigating some of these issues are all these difficulty options, by far one of the game's best features. From enemy damage to hunger and weapon degradation, a number of settings can be customized, giving Into the Radius a spectrum of experiences and difficulties ranging from easy and extremely accessible to an Iron Man mode that disables manual saving. Customizable difficulty is a great addition, but there are wider design problems that go beyond what these settings can fix. Into the Radius has two types of missions: regular and top priority. Regular missions, most of which are usually pretty short, keep money coming in and your inventory stocked. Top priority missions progress the story, unlock better gear for purchase, and are usually a little longer and more complicated. Regular missions get repetitive pretty quickly. Using anomaly probes and an artifact detector to navigate an anomaly field and search for artifacts is fun and tense a few times, but after a while it gets a little stale. This repetitiveness wouldn't be much of a problem if you weren't forced to complete regular missions in order to unlock top priority missions. I don't know why missions are structured this way, but I'm not a fan of it. Into the Radius has plenty of content, so it's confusing why the game artificially inflates itself with repetitive side missions. Regardless, after 20 or so hours, when you're comfortable with your stock of food and ammo and you'd rather just progress the story, checking off a few regular missions to unlock a top priority mission becomes a chore. When Into the Radius is slow, creepy, and quiet, it is a phenomenal game. Combat is great when it's limited and intimate. Small shootouts against a couple enemies or defending yourself from the odd attack as you're traveling the radius. While there are only a few types of enemies, all enemies attack in distinct ways and force you to react differently. I really love the way enemies are designed. It's a small stroke of brilliance. Some are fast, others are slow, some will sneak up on you, and others you'll hear coming from far away. And again, how best to deal with enemies is something you'll likely need to learn on your own. Mimics are the enemy type you'll have shootouts with. Mimics behave erratically, they don't just stay in cover, and that makes them challenging opponents. Sometimes they'll sneak up on your position, and other times they'll run away from you and reposition. Fighting a small group of them, especially as you're moving through a building, is a lot of fun. They do tend to be pretty accurate and much faster to the trigger than you, which is a little bothersome, but some of my favorite moments were methodically clearing buildings room by room, gun up and checking corners. Occasionally, though, Into the Radius leans away from that slower pace and replaces it with a louder, more combat-oriented pace that the game really struggles to handle well. When pit against large groups of enemies, often in top priority missions, combat becomes much more inconsistent, and it's also where I found myself getting frustrated the most with Into the Radius. I never really found a level of challenge I was happy with. Most of the game's standard settings for things like hunger, weapon degradation, and enemy damage I actually feel are really well balanced. Hunger doesn't damage health, it only siphons away stamina, and most weapon maintenance is cheap and usually doesn't take that long. And it all adds to that equation you do in your head of how much longer you want to, or are even able to, risk staying out in the radius. But after about 15 hours playing the normal difficulty, I found combat to be more frustrating and disorganized than challenging. I tried to tweak the settings to make enemies fewer in number and more dangerous, but that didn't seem to improve much. Why Into the Radius feels it needs sections with tons of enemy combatants, I don't know, but it turns combat into a slog. Partially to blame here are Into the Radius's controls, which, generally speaking, really aren't that great. You'll find weapons, magazines, and other equipment in normal VR places like your back, stomach, and hip, but after 50 hours, I still have trouble consistently grabbing my pistol or a magazine without having to look, or placing something in one of my arm slots without it falling. Looking through cupboards and drawers is finicky and clumsy. Sometimes your hands work seamlessly, and other times they have severe trouble grabbing nearby objects. If you put a scope on a rifle, a smoothing effect gets applied to how the rifle controls, as though you're moving the weapon through water. There's no way to turn this setting off or adjust it, and while I assume it's meant as a player aid, it feels more like an overcompensation. When compared to something like Onward, another VR shooter with similar grounded weapon mechanics, Into the Radius feels older and outdated, even if its weapon ballistics may be more realistic. All these issues are relatively common problems in VR, but all of Into the Radius's multitude of complex actions and equipment are based on controls that lack a solid foundation. This kind of narrative device, Into the Radius's radius, has famously been used in the past as a way to convey heavy metaphor. Whether we're talking the zone or the shimmer, these are settings that mean or reveal something. Into the Radius attempts to engage with similar themes, but fails to explore any deeper understandings. It gets caught up in confusing explanations about why the radius is a certain way, rather than exploring what it means for the radius to be that way. For all its interesting ideas, it's disappointing that Into the Radius resorts to repetitive and hollow fetch quests or missions where the only real obstacle is shooting a bunch of enemies. That said, there is an impressive amount of passion and creativity on display here, as well as a clear vision that makes Into the Radius distinct from its inspirations. My hours walking the beautiful wasteland of Into the Radius may have been occasionally frustrating, but I was also stopped in my tracks a couple times. It is an experience unlike any I've played in VR, and while its ambitions are lofty, it does succeed more than it fails. Room for improvement is ample. It's not yet the VR iteration of Stalker many of us wish for, if not at least the iteration I wish for, but it maintains the excitement I have for VR as a medium. Into the Radius shows that complex survival horror built for VR, be it Stalker-like or not, is not only possible, but also probable. A question I'm not sure big VR fans like myself were confident in just 6 or 7 years ago.